Hi guys, I am Joy Cherick and I am a homeschooling mother of 6 and I implement the Charlotte Mason philosophy in my homeschool. And today I am joined by my friend Nicole Cottrell, and she is at Startup Wife on Instagram if you want to go find her over there. And Nicole is a homeschooling mom of 3. She is a student of the Charlotte Mason philosophy and strives to apply those classic principles in her homeschool. Nicole is biracial. Her father is Black and her mother is white. She grew up being split between her mom's house in Phoenix, and her dad's house in Los Angeles. Nicole and I met before we were both married. She was the very first one of my peers to cut away from the mainstream and start homeschooling. And she was also the very first one, one of my peers, but also someone a little bit ahead of me, to sit down with me and explain the nuts and bolts of homeschooling. She shared with me what she was doing, and we also talked a lot in that first conversation about Charlotte Mason. We reconnected through a Charlotte Mason book club in Phoenix before my family left that area when we closed our business and moved away across the country. Now we are in Tennessee. Today, we join the national conversation happening about race. What is our response as mothers and homeschoolers? What about our homeschools, our history, which biographies we select? How can we help our children learn about this issue in a healthy and productive way? What are some good books about Black men and Black women that we should not miss? What types of books should we avoid? What is the redemptive answer in all of this? We are going to be talking about some of these issues today. Nicole, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Joy. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. All right, so just if we could start off by, could you share with us a little bit about your family and your homeschool, ages, grades, that kind of thing?
So we've been homeschooling from the beginning, as they say. We never made it to any other school, but besides our homeschool. My oldest is Riley, my daughter. She's 13, almost 14. My middle is Tolan. He's about to turn 12 in a few days. And then my youngest is Beckett, and he's 8, almost 9. So we have 2 in Form 3, entering Form 3, and 1 in Form 2, essentially. Okay. And yeah, we love all of the real Charlotte Mason things. They love, my children are inspired by those ideas. Like, we love nature study, we love being outside, we love exploring science, literature, music. They each have their specific things that they're drawn to, but as a whole, it suits all of us, and I can't imagine doing school any other way.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like you get on that side and you're like, oh, this opened up a whole new world, and I can't go back.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so as you're talking to your kids, how does the gospel help you as you work to encourage your children, just talking about the different varieties and also just the different cultural diversity that we have, even just within your own family?
Yeah, you definitely touched on one thing that we communicate a lot to our children is we talk to them very much about people being image bearers. And when I think that's actually an easy idea for children to grasp onto, because I do believe they naturally see people for people before a lot of other influences and narratives start to come in and maybe shift some of that thinking. I think it's really easy for children to honor individuals and to find the dignity that's in people. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the dignity that God has imparted to people as image bearers. And because of that dignity, we are called to honor that in them, whether they've yet to know the Lord or not. That's one of the ways that we frame it. And I know that maybe sounds like a really big concept for children, but I found that my children very easily can relate to that and understand that.
So do you agree, or, Charlotte Mason kind of talks about how kids can either have great propensity for good or for bad.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about that concept in
Mm-hmm.
regards to what you're saying?
We've talked about it so much in our Charlotte Mason book club. Man,
Yeah.
that question we've around and around and around.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, I really believe it varies per child.
And it depends on the circumstance.
Right. And I think that kind of harkens back to Charlotte's her original idea that if children are born persons,
right,
they're going to hold within themselves all the good that they could want and need, and all the bad that they could want and need. And we obviously have responsibility as parents.
It comes back to us, right. To correct and not just let them become weeds in their own garden. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And every parent probably has like the one child, and I have that one child, and I would have said, I know what I'm doing. I've got this parenting thing semi-down, and then this child proves you quite wrong.
Right.
And you see the propensity in them for making bad decisions regularly, when that's not being modeled for them, because they are their own person. And it does then become habit training and correction and sharing Jesus.
Yeah, the gospel is such an important aspect of our homes each day that, just we need it ministered to us. Mm-hmm. Just that reminder, just a little bit every day.
Right.
This is why he died for us. Great.
Exactly right.
So I've used the word Black to describe specific people a couple of times, just even in our conversation today. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that mentioning a person's skin color makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Yeah.
Is it okay to describe someone based on, honestly, how they're bearing God's image physically? Right. What do you think about that? And why is it uncomfortable?
It's a really good question. A lot of people have been asking me this question lately, and I think it's a really good and important one. One of the things that you and I had briefly talked about before is the concept of being colorblind, and color blindness as a concept, which is saying, I don't see race. I recognize the content of the character of an individual, which is, we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and his comments. And the concept of colorblindness came out of the civil rights movement. And it was a way of thinking that helped to propel the way forward in that movement. And they really wanted to focus on the aspect of character over the color of the skin. Makes perfect sense. I think that not in as many recent, but in the last really 15, 20 years, that concept has gotten some criticism. And part of the reason is because it hasn't necessarily worked. And it hasn't worked in so much as when people don't notice skin color, or they pretend that they don't notice skin color, it's not necessarily helping Black or people of color in this country, because that isn't something they can take off, and they are always Black or Latin or Indigenous, whatever it is. They don't have the option of turning that off. And so the conversation now has become very much, let's honor the person of color in front of us and acknowledge that they're a person of color, that we don't do any harm in doing that. We're actually honoring who they actually are. We're honoring their experience as a person of color, or as a Black person, because it's not our experience if we're white. It's very different. And so it feels like a little taboo, and it always feels a little strange. Like, do you say this? Do you not? How do you refer to people? So I share this story because I think it's kind of helpful. My son, Tolan, who's about to turn 12, he's a part of a theater group, Christian Youth Theater. And when you join, they partner you with another student who is an older student. They're like your buddy. So he gets home, and I say, hey, who's your partner? Who's your buddy? And I know a lot of the kids, and he's like describing this kid, and I'm like, okay, I don't know who that is. And he keeps describing him, and I'm like, gosh, I don't know who you're talking about. And then finally I look at him and I say, is he Black? And he's like, yeah, but I didn't know if I was supposed to say that. And I like that illustration because my son has a half Black mom. He has Black grandparents and a Black uncle and friends, and he's a quarter Black himself, and he didn't know if he should use that word to describe someone.
Yeah.
And so I said to him, if you're describing a person and you're saying there's a group of children standing at the playground and you're talking about the Black girl in the group, and you said, I ate lunch with her today, and you said, I ate lunch with the Black girl that's over there, that's actually totally acceptable. It would have been totally acceptable for my son to say, I was partnered with Will and he's Black, because that's a descriptor. Where we run into trouble is when we use a racial reference when it has nothing to do with the conversation, that's where I think people start to feel nervous and uncomfortable. Or sometimes we'll attach race in a conversation where it's irrelevant or where there is an implied negative connotation to it. The other example I've given is if you said 3 students took an exam and they all scored an A and one of them was Black, there could be a bias there that people might clue in on or assume because you're calling out the Black student when that has nothing to do with the conversation. Does that kind of make sense?
Interesting.
So I think too, from the Black community's perspective, and I can't speak for the whole Black community, but at least from my family, there's pride in being Black, and people say Black is beautiful and all of that. So there's not a negative in describing a person as Black. Again, it's when it's attached to a case where there's no need to mention race. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. And I always tell people to ask someone, there's no harm in asking your friends or people who are Black or people of color, ask them what their preference is. Some people do prefer to be called African American. Some people prefer to be just Black. If I'm around the Black family, I call myself mixed because that's just a more common vernacular there.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you about that because I heard somebody else who has biracial mixed children. Yeah. I don't know. And I was like, and she was saying she was using the word mixed.
Right. Which is usually just a more casual reference. And that's usually what the Black community calls children who are biracial.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And they know what that means.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's totally acceptable to ask too. And
we're just learning. Well, and I think also it's changing. Yes. So you and I have messaged a couple times throughout the years, specifically when we were both studying the Civil War at the same time by coincidence, about books, biographies. I think we even geeked out over Frederick Douglass's famous speech that everyone has to read, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." And I think this video will come out around the 4th of July. And I just think that is such an important speech to read aloud with your family. Even just read it aloud to yourself. It's just easier to read speeches aloud is why I'm saying read it aloud.
Right. Yes.
Just because you get a sense of the awe. Now he gave that speech about 10 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. So here is this escaped slave, Frederick Douglass, speaking in the North, to a group of, I'm assuming white.
Probably primarily.
Yeah. About how funny it is that as Americans, they're sitting there celebrating their freedom when yet there's this blight. And of course, everyone talks about the blight. So, and everybody kind of talks about that, but he does a really good job of articulating it. I think he's probably one of my favorite American authors.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm putting him up there with the writers of the Constitution and everything. Just he's so eloquent.
So eloquent.
So I just want us to talk a little bit about some biographies that we've really enjoyed, and some books. It doesn't necessarily have to just be Civil War era. You had mentioned that your family was your Black family was really intentional to make sure that you were educated about Black history in a way that you knew was not happening in school.
Right. Right.
And that certainly, I mean, just history in general was, it's just a disservice.
Yeah.
Such a waste of time. Now, like being a homeschooling mom, we're able to learn history.
Yeah.
We get to have a relationship with these people through their biographies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'd love for you to share, you know, some of the books and biographies and just even names that are important to know about. Because honestly, when I started reading and researching, I was like, I didn't even know this person existed. And that it was like a tragedy that I didn't know their name, because their stories are so beautiful, inspiring, and they help us understand as a country, you know, our history, because I think understanding our history does help us know and shape how we can move forward.
Yeah. So there's, I mean, I have some in mind that are directed more for children too, but I really have loved learning about Ida B. Wells, and people do know about her, but I find her story especially inspiring. She was one of the editors of a newspaper at the time, and helped fund and found that newspaper. She was almost single-handedly responsible for illuminating the North on the number of lynchings of Black men in the South. She actually researched and wrote a paper, essentially a pamphlet that she distributed through the North to actually gain allies in that fight.
Wow.
She was tireless and inspirational. She's a fantastic writer. So there are a lot of great books on her life for children and adults. And she's mentioned, I do think, but you know, I didn't learn about her in school, certainly, and really started to learn more about her on my own around college. I also thought of some books for children, or just some great people from history, like Benjamin Banneker. We had talked about Benjamin Banneker, had we?
No, I don't know who that is.
Oh, he's so fascinating to me. So he was an inventor, scientist, yes. And he's credited as helping build the first clock in the United States, like from indigenous wood. So he used only wood from where he was living.
Cool.
Yeah, fascinating man. And he actually created a lot of things, invented a lot of things, but he also wrote to Thomas Jefferson at the time in I can't remember what year, 1770 something. He was personally very, very moved and grieved over the plight of Black Americans at the time. And he thought, well, who better to ask than the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence? I'm going to write to him. And Thomas Jefferson wrote him back, and they actually had quite a long amount of correspondence.
And where was Benjamin Banneker? He was in the United States?
He was in the United States.
He was free?
He was free. He had I believe, if I remember correctly, one of his parents was a slave, had been a slave, and one of his parents had been set free when he was older. Mm-hmm. So he was a free man at the time. And he's just a fascinating person. And you can find some of the letters of correspondence and how he was engaging the conversation. And just even taking the time and the courage to write to Thomas Jefferson. I just find that so fascinating. There's a new book that came out. This is for children, but and I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, but it's called Beautiful Shades of Brown, The Art of Laurel Wheeler Waring. And Laura Wheeler was born in the late 19th century, and she was an artist, and she had the opportunity. She was born obviously phrase late 19th century, but she was a Black artist, of which there were not many. And she had the opportunity to study in Paris. And I really like the idea of this book because I think it speaks a lot to representation, or the lack of representation. So she's studying Matisse and Gauguin, who were kind of her inspirations. And she was looking around thinking, there are no Black portraits. There are no portraits of Black individuals.
Right.
So she actually came back to Philadelphia, and she began painting Black or African American portraits. That became her specific study in art. And her paintings are now in the National Portrait Gallery.
Wow.
So she's just a really wonderful.
And what time period was she active?
Late 19th century is when she was born. So she was painting.
Oh, okay. Early 1900s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Henry Ossawa Tanner.
Yes, he's wonderful.
A little bit earlier.
Yes, he's a little earlier.
Because he went to France too.
Yeah, mid 1800s, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it was around. Yeah, it was around the Civil War.
Yeah, and we've studied him, and I've heard Charlotte Masoners communicate that they really hope that there will be more, as an example, studies of artists who are people of color. I hope that there's going to be more of those being produced soon too. Tanner's one of the only ones that I know of,
right,
where you can actually, see his artwork. So
yeah, there's actually a really cool collection of folk art that was done about the Great Migration.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's Jacob Lawrence.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's got these
he's a wonderful artist.
And what I liked about his art, what kind of put me onto him was when I read the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, he had done a full illustration, like a full art show of the life.
Mm-hmm.
So I just totally geeked out over that. I was like, and it was hard to find the book, on and on, because of what you're saying. Now, I mean, it's more, like I said, it's folk art. Right. It's not fine art like, Ossawa Tanner and some of these other folks. Right. But I think it's important because that's not even something we talk about at all in our country, is the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. You can explain it better than me.
Well, I mean, the Great Migration, there's some really great books for kids on that. There's one called The Rope. I love that book. It's a picture book, but that discusses the Great Migration.
I mean, picture books often give a good overview of stuff so that it can whet the appetite, so that when you get into something more meaty, you at least know where you're going.
Yeah. But I think you two bring up a really good point about, like, he's Lawrence is painting folk art. Right. One of the things that starts to happen is sometimes we're not able to examine some of the art of other cultures, because if it doesn't fall into a certain category. But take like Native American or indigenous art, for example, a lot of that art is actually represented in jewelry making, in pottery, in clothing design, in headdresses, etc. And so I think sometimes we have to expand as Charlotte Masoners what it is that we're willing to study and learn from. Yeah. That is their example of fine art as a people group. And so sometimes we have to be willing to step outside of what is maybe a little more traditional, right, to learn more.
Right. Well, and again, like, these narrative stories are so helpful. Mm-hmm. To help us understand the history of our country, and also understand the history of a people. Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway, it just, breaks your heart that is another reason maybe why they leave it out of a lot of the conversations, is because it is a hard, sad history.
Right.
And I was actually reading a lot about, John Taylor Gatto was talking about how at the turn of the 18 to 1900s, like around that, the beginning of the 20th century, they started taking out death in children's stories and sanitizing. And of course, Disney, all of his narrations are like kind of these sanitized versions of these fairy tales. And a lot of that has to do with just Disney's personality, but a lot of it also has to do with the mood, right? We're just wanting things to be whitewashed. Like, Disney went so far as he was a chain smoker. Mm-hmm. He would never let you take a picture of him or be videoed smoking, because he had a certain persona that he needed to put out there. But understanding, we're not getting the full picture. Mm-hmm. Not that we need to, we have to use discernment when we're sharing things with our children. Age appropriate that's a thing.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
but also, we really want to lean in and kind of go, okay, well, how can we share these stories and give a more well-rounded view of the
Right.
history of our country?
Right. I think too, you know, you still want to or should hopefully be able to address your child's individual
Mm.
sensitivities and proclivities. I have one child who is deeply sensitive when it comes to discussions of the history of slavery in this country. I mean, she hasn't been able to get through certain books because she's just crying and
Oh,
crying.
yeah.
And then I have another one of my sons who is just full of righteous anger and wants to tackle these subjects and
Yeah,
dive
it
right in.
like
Right. And so,
it built him up.
right. And so we have these different responses, none of which are right or wrong. Each is appropriate. But how do we sort of temper those conversations for the child individually too, and recognize that they're taking in what they need, as Charlotte would say. They're taking in what they need, and we don't have to necessarily make sure they're consuming all of these stories.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you an opportunity to rattle out a few more biographies and books.
These are a couple more for children.
Okay.
But there is The Other Mozart. Do you know that book?
No.
Okay. It's Chevalier de Saint George. Forgive my poor French right there, but he was a violinist, virtuoso, really, and composer, a Black violinist and virtuoso in the 18th century. And so he was touring throughout Europe.
Wow.
He was a French Black composer. He was invited to Versailles. He traveled as far as the Indies, as far as India to perform. And you can actually listen to his recordings. So here's another option for a composer to listen to in our Charlotte Mason studies, who was writing around the same time as Mozart, who is a brilliant Black composer in France at the time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of books available about him. I can think of like a couple of for children specifically, and then there are some for adults too, if for people who are perhaps interested in reading more about his life. Is really fascinating man.
And we'll just, for anyone listening and watching, we will leave a list in the description of all the books, so that you can go check them out.
Yeah. And then I'll mention one more. This is Arturo Schomburg. He has a book. There's a book about him this is a children's book, but I really like it, called The Man Who Built a Library. And this book takes place this was really happening in the Harlem Renaissance, during the Harlem Renaissance in New York. And what essentially happened was Arturo loved going to the library, to the New York Public Library, but he started kind of collecting African and African American art and stories and books and literature and poetry and on his own, very much inspired through the Harlem Renaissance movement. But his collection grew so much so he had nowhere to store it. People in the boroughs were coming and using his collection, and he was he actually went to New York Public Library and was given a space there to house. So he essentially created the first African-American library section at the New York Public Library. Also a fascinating story, and a really, really, really interesting for children also to learn about, I think, preservation of ideas and how important that is, and how important stories are to keep and make available.
That concludes part 1 of my 2-part conversation with Nicole Cottrell, where we are talking about race, books, and applying Charlotte Mason's ideas to this cultural moment. In the next part of our conversation, Nicole and I compare and contrast AmblesideOnline and the Alveary. We also share some inspiring Charlotte Mason quotes and, of course, how the gospel is always relevant. You can find the rest of the conversation on my YouTube channel, Joy Cherick, and also is available to listen to on the Homeschool Parents podcast.